Good evening. I'm Naomi Lewin, former afternoon music host on WQXR and host of the weekly radio feature and podcast Classics for Kids. Today's program for 9to-Y is all about the organ, which Mozart called the king of instruments, and we are very grateful to have four reigning monarchs of the organ join us. Paul Jacobs was born in Washington, Pennsylvania. He apparently chose to ignore the fact that his hometown is the center of the universe for pony baseball, which is a close relative of Little League. Instead, Paul got his mitts, but fortunately not his cleats, on the organ, and every organist in attendance is now cringing at the thought of cleats on organ pedals. Paul performs all over the world, and he also has a steady gig as chair of the organ department at the Juilliard School. He must have a Dorian Gray type portrait stashed somewhere because Paul became a professor at Juilliard almost 2 decades ago. David Hurd is a native New Yorker, born in Brooklyn, raised in Queens. If you have used the Episcopal Church hymnal 1982 or any number of other hymnals, you know David's work because he's also a prolific composer. And not just hymns and organ music. A few years back, the Dessau Choirs premiered an orchestrated version of David's memorial cantata in honor of Martin for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These days, David is organist and music director at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in New York's Times Square, which is affectionately known as Smoky Mary's for its enthusiastic use of incense. Canadian organist Rachel Laurin hails from Saint-Benoît, Quebec. Saint-Benoît, or Saint Benedict, is named for Benedict of Nursia, patron saint of Europe, school children, kidney disease, monks, and poisoning. I am not going to look for a common thread there. Rachel now lives in Ottawa, where she was titular organist at Notre Dame Cathedral, which I mention mostly because I love the title Titular Organist. Since leaving that job, she has spent most of her time composing, including a concerto for vibraphone and marimba, and a burlesque for organ and saxophone. In case it's not obvious from her birthplace, as you will hear from Rachel's accent, she is French Canadian. As you will not hear from Greg Zelek's accent, he is a Cuban American who grew up in Miami. The music and organ worlds being as small as they are, Greg was a student of Paul Jacobs at Juilliard before he moved to Madison, Wisconsin to take one of the more unusual organ jobs in the country. 20 years ago, the Madison Symphony Orchestra commissioned a new organ for its concert hall. The organ was a gift from Pleasant T. Rowland, the woman who created American Girl dolls and books. Greg's position is officially a curatorship, and I will let him explain later exactly what that means. For everyone out there in Zoom land, whether you are a rank amateur or a titular organist, this is your everything you've ever wanted to know about the organ but were afraid to ask opportunity. Please put your questions into the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of them as possible. So this evening, we are really talking about the pipe organ, which is not really something your parents can leave under the Christmas tree for you like another instrument. So I'd like to know briefly from each of you how you discovered the organ and what made you say, that's for me. David, why don't you start?
Well, I was practically born in church. And so the first live music that I ever heard was music of the organ and choral music. And I immediately liked it. And from a very small child, of course, having been born into a family where at least all the women played the keyboard. There was a lot of piano playing, recreational piano playing at all family events. So the keyboard was familiar to me from a very early age, and the idea of playing the keyboard was familiar, and I just loved the sound of the organ in church. So that's my attraction.
We see another keyboard instrument behind you.
Yes, it's a harpsichord, a lovely harpsichord in the Flemish tradition, built by Paul Kennedy in 1995.
Okay, well, Rachel, how did you start playing the organ?
Well, Saint Benoit, where I'm born in the village, is a small village, the saint of poisoning. So I was poisoned by the organ. My mother was the organist of the church, and we lived just in front of the church. And she was a pianist, and she taught the piano to every of her 7 children. But she told me, go and try the organ at the church if you want to. And then I went and I tried the keyboard, and it didn't play. And so I was not sure what the gray box beside the organ was for. But I went back home and I said, well, the organ doesn't work. And she was completely panicked. And finally she said, did you start the engine? Did you start the power? I said, what's that? So that's when I learned that the piano was different from the organ. That was the main thing. But I fell in love with the organ when I was at college, and I had a real organ teacher. And then I discovered the repertoire, and I discovered that the organ was more than just Bach's music, and I discovered the symphonic French composers and everything. So I was about 17 or 18. And before that, I was more centered on the piano playing.
And what's the instrument behind you?
Oh, it's just it's an electronic Johannes. It's a practice instrument, and it has 3 manuals and some pistons. So I feel quite privileged to be able to practice at home because I play at a church where it's very busy and there are masses all over the day. So anyway, it's just an electronic organ, but I think it's quite valuable.
And Greg, since you have an instrument behind you, let's hear about that and about how you got started.
Yeah, so this was built by Bruce Case, who's a local Madisonian, who tunes and maintains the overture concert organ that you mentioned, Pleasant Rowland paid for here in Madison. And he built this for the curator and donated it to the symphony. So it resides in my home and isn't too loud, so my neighbors don't complain. I'm certainly playing the organ now in large part because of Paul Jacobs. But I started, both my parents are attorneys, so they did not necessarily expect any of their children to play the pipe organ as an occupation. That was certainly not in the cards in their minds. However, there was a beautiful organ built in Miami, Florida at the Catholic middle school that I was attending, and I started taking piano lessons there with the organist, and he recommended that I start playing the organ to make some money on the weekends so that I could take my girlfriend out for the movies. And that was sort of it. Some people say, do you have a romantic story? I said, well, sort of, but not romantic in the way that some people would think of it. It was just, at that time, it was a way to make some money for the weekends. And now this is what I'm doing. So it's wonderful.
And while we're on the subject of that curatorship, what does that mean to be the curator of the organ there?
Sure. So it's in part not just the taking care of the instrument, which is more just scheduling for Bruce Case to come in and do a lot of that maintenance, but it's more curating the series. And we have 4 performances as part of the Madison Symphony Orchestra organ series. And I usually play about 1 or 2 of them, and then we have guest artists throughout the year. And we have, 1,000+ people that come to these organ events and support so incredibly. And I feel I'm so fortunate to be in a place like Madison, where there's just so much support for the instrument and the repertoire and everything we're doing here. And it's really thrilling.
And last but not least, Paul, what is the spectacular instrument behind you, and how did you avoid pony baseball?
Well, these are just golden curtains here in the hotel room. How I avoided pony baseball, I have no idea. Actually, the Steelers are pretty big where I come from, the Pittsburgh Steelers. But my whole family loves the Steelers and pony baseball. I'm the black sheep of the family. I come from a non-musical family, but I was fortunate to have the support from them in my love and quest in music. And it was like many organists in church that I became introduced to this instrument. And I would work my way into the gallery and watch Sister Helen as a young boy play the postlude on Sundays. And she was a terrible organist in retrospect. But when I was an early teenager, they got a very fine organist from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh who played the music of Jean Langlais, 20th century French composer. And my ears never heard anything so wild and spectacular as that music. And I was hooked from that point on. Forget football. Give me music. Give me the organ.
As I said, this program is for both organ buffs and the organ curious. So in just a moment, we're going to have a lightning round of some organ terms. But first, Paul, why don't you explain in 25 words or less, or maybe I'll give you 50, how pipe organs work?
Oh, well, the organ is a wind instrument and a keyboard instrument, and you need a stable wind supply, and then that wind supply is stored in a reservoir, and then once a stop is pulled on the organ console, that's the cockpit for the organist, where the organist sits and there are all those knobs and keyboards and pedals. Once a stop is pulled, the wind from the reservoir goes and sits underneath certain pipes, and then when a key is played, the wind fills the pipes and you have sound.
Okay, so speaking of the lightning round, thank you. That was very succinct and very wonderful. So you just mentioned two of the words in my lightning round, console and stop. So why don't you define those?
Sure. Well, the console is the key desk. I think I said cockpit. It's the control center for the organist, and that's where the organist plays. And you have multiple keyboards, anywhere from 1 to usually 3 or 4. Some organs have 5 or 6 even, and a pedal board. And each of these keyboards controls different areas of the organ, different choruses of pipes. And the stops that are drawn, you think of a painter with a large palette of colors, and that painter can choose the different colors and mix and mingle them together. It's similar to the stops of an organ. They're sounds, different sounds that you can combine with one another. So console and stops.
Thank you. David, I'll let you go next. Paul just alluded to the pedal board. Why don't you take that and also the word manual?
Well, manual, it refers to the hand, the keyboards that are operated by hands. And pedal board refers to the keyboard that's operated by the feet. And organs, for the large part of the history of the organ, have had a keyboard specifically for the feet that plays up to 2.5 octaves worth of sound. And the hands typically are responsible for somewhere between 4 and 5 octaves of pitches.
Rachel, your turn. How about the word rank?
Well, the rank is, let me study my English now. The rank is a row of pipes, because each stop is a row of pipe. So, for example, if you have the flute 8, it means that you will have 1 pipe for each key, for each note. And 8 foot means that the higher pipe of this row, of this rank, will be, the higher will be 8 feet high. Is it clear enough?
So the rank is like a scale of pipes.
Exactly. So it represents, you have 1 pipe for each key of this precise. So, and you can have, if you have an oboe, for example, you will have exactly the same, 1 rank. The oboe 8 will be 1 rank, 1 row of pipes going from the lower C to the higher note of the manual, of the keyboard.
And, if I could just say, rank and stop are sometimes used synonymously. They're very, very closely related.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, Greg, why don't you take division?
Sure. It's essentially a section of the organ that is comprised of its own keyboard or pedal board. So you can have the pedal division, which is played by the feet. You can have the swell division, which is enclosed in shutters. So it's a division of the organ that you can manually open and close shutters that allows the sound to come out and then decrease. And then you usually have what's called the choir division on American instruments. And the great division, which is sort of your center division. On American instruments, it's generally the manual that's in the middle, and on French instruments, it's the lowest manual. So, and there are of course corresponding stops in each of those divisions that are played by those keyboards.
David, Cymbelstern.
Cymbelstern. It's or star, Stern, a star that has bells on it. And the bells rotate and tinkle. And traditionally, the Cymbelstern was run by wind, kind of like a windmill. And the windmill sort of turned the star, and as the star turned, the bells would tinkle. And it was one of the many earlier sound effects, if you will, novelty stops that was very popular in the Baroque period. And often used to complement organ music.
I just threw that one in for fun because I adore the Cymbelstern. That was always when I was singing in choirs and it got played at Christmas time. That was magic.
They're fun to look at and they're fun to listen to.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so now let's put some visuals and audio to those terms and get some music and actually see an organ in action. And we're going to start with Paul. So why don't you tell us what we're going to hear you play and on what organ? And I'm going to apologize right off the bat because for time, I'm having to start some of these not at the beginning.
Sure.
Including Paul's.
Yeah, well, we're going to hear a portion of a Handel organ concerto beginning somewhere in the middle of the second movement is B-flat concerto, played at the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia. It's an organ built by Dobson, and the organist is responsible for choosing all of the registrations and stops in this piece.
Registration was something that I skipped in the thing, but we'll get to registration a little bit later, I guess. So yes, and when did you record this?
This was in November.
So this past November.
Correct.
Okay, well, let's hear some music. fantastically dramatic in that spotlight. It was really beautiful. That's a pretty big beast, that organ.
It is. I think there are something over 6,000 pipes in it. And, Philadelphia is very fortunate to have such a treasure. And it's used, in a solo capacity and with orchestra regularly.
And you have, I should say that Lindsay from the 92nd Street Y, who's behind the scenes in this session, is going to be posting links in chat to your upcoming performances and to where you can go to see the rest of this video. You do have some gigs coming up with Philadelphia, correct?
Yes. In fact, that's where I am now. I was actually on this organ that we just heard for 4 hours today, preparing for some rehearsals with the Philadelphia Orchestra this week. We're doing a chamber version of Mahler's Das Lied, and then the Poulenc Concerto, of course. So it's wonderful to work with Yannick and Yannick Nézet-Séguin and such a great collection of musicians. So, and this Handel and Bach will be available as a full performance at some point in the spring.
I got to ask, what was it like to win the only Grammy Award ever given to an organist?
It was totally unexpected, Naomi. I was absolutely convinced that it wasn't going to happen, that it couldn't happen. I didn't go to the ceremony, and in fact, when I was informed of being nominated, that was shocking enough. And then somebody told me about, just you wait, and then I got a phone call that saying that I won the Grammy, and I was absolutely thrilled by it. And I'm just glad that this instrument, this great instrument, is now recognized along with every other instrument, as it should be.
You okay, Rachel? We losing?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I had to plug my computer. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I just want to make sure you're all right.
I wanted to stay in the picture.
No, it's fine. Just so long as your chair isn't exploding or something. So, to me, it looks like octopus doesn't begin to describe what you guys are doing there. You're playing with what looks like 5 hands and 2 feet. First of all, how hard is it to learn to play melodies with your feet? I can't even dance with my feet. So, Greg, how hard is it to learn to play a melody with your feet?
Oh, it's a piece of cake. No, I think it's like with anything, you've got to be coordinated. I think all organists have to be coordinated by birth. But it's like with anything, you devote enough time to it and you work enough at it, and it almost becomes second nature. I couldn't imagine not having the opportunity to play with both my hands and my feet. You can do just about anything on this instrument, and it's what makes the performing of it not only challenging, but also so rewarding.
It looks to me, between the hands and the feet, it's also like, patting your head and rubbing your stomach. How do you train, Rachel, your hands and your feet to do different things at once?
Well, I think that Greg quite summarized it well. It's a question of work, because I confess that when I came to the organ, I was 17, 18 years old, and it was quite difficult for me to pass to playing with feet and hands at the same time. I was able to play Chopin on the piano, but and we began to work, some pieces with just the left hand and the pedal, just the right hand and the pedal alone, and then we put everyone together. But the most difficult for me was to do the left hand and the pedal. So, and it was my problem, my personal problem. I'm sure everyone has different experiences. So it took me a few years before being comfortable playing really polyphonies with feet and hands. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be a speed skater. And so I decided finally to speed skate on the organ. When I was able to play pedal, I was so happy that now I like to play virtuosity on pedal board. And but it's always a work to do, a work in progress.
Well, speaking of skates and cleats, let's talk shoes. You guys must have very specific shoe needs. David, what are your shoe needs?
Well, the purpose of an organ shoe, it seems to me, there are two things. One is, for many people, to have a shoe that one can feel somewhat through. That is the sole is not so stiff that one doesn't feel it's flexible, and also that it doesn't extend any more width than necessary, so that you have a narrow and flexible shoe, but also to protect the pedal board, because it's wood, and if you use your street shoes, they may be gritty and dirty on the bottom and have the effect of sandpaper on the pedals, which is a maintenance issue. And a cleanliness issue. So I think that those are the two kind of areas where the shoes are important. But I'd like to say just another word about the whole issue of pedal, and that is that so many organists come to the organ from the piano, and in playing the piano, it's very simple that the left hand is the bass. It's on the bottom. There it is, and the low keys are where the left hand is, and that's very natural. And when you come to the organ, so often the tenor line, the tenor middle register is played by the left hand, and the pedal is playing the bass. And when I first began to study the organ, my left hand always wanted to play the pedal part, and to liberate the left hand from thinking that it always had to play the bass was a real job to do, and practice comes in there. And then, of course, then you have pieces where you have a tenor or an alto melody in the pedal, and the left hand is playing the bass again. So again, practice.
Is the pedal always connected to the bass notes, or can you connect it?
No, there are stops that you can choose of any number of pitches, so that can play the bass. And in the old organs, it did play a lot of times the bass, because that's where the big pallets were, and you took the force of the foot to open the big valves. But that's not so much the issue today. But no, the pedal very often plays a melody that's not in the bass.
So we've been talking about all these different ranks and manuals and pedals and stuff like that. When you start in on a new piece, how do you decide on the registration? Registration is choosing what sounds you're going to use. Paul, how do you do that, or how do you teach people to do that?
Well, I think you could potentially open up a can of worms with that question among some organists, because some organists are, I would say some, can be very rigid when it comes to registration. And there are certain rules and you follow them. And oftentimes these rules work, but not always. And given the varied nature of the pipe organ, you have to be flexible. And composers like Mendelssohn and others indicated in prefaces to their organ works that you really have to take each instrument on its own merit and make decisions and tailor your decisions for an instrument. So you think maybe of an organist like an orchestrator, in a sense, being able to carefully select the stops. And one advantage that exists is that repertoire never is old or tedious, because from organ to organ, it could take on an entirely new life, which is part of the joy of playing the instrument.
Anybody have anything else you want to add about?
Yes, I can add that as a composer, the step in composing that I hate the most for an organ piece is to put registrations. And we have to do so because we have to give the performer an idea of what we hear or what kind of family what kind of sound we want. It's a little bit of an orchestration that we put on paper, but at the same time, I want so much the performer to feel free because the performer can have best ideas than myself on my own work. I can give an example of that of the Isabelle Demers, who was one of the greatest organists of the world and a former pupil, a former student of Paul Jacobs. And Isabelle, she played my Etude Heroique once, and then I heard her doing a registration that I didn't thought of when I composed that, but I was so surprised and I was so amazed that when I played a piece, since then, I always put the registration of Isabelle for this very passage. So I think the performer has to feel free. And for my music, so I think that when I play Bach's music, I feel as free to do whatever I want to.
You guys are so often hidden when you perform or you have your back to the audience. How do you make a connection? Because I'm a singer and, you know, I'm standing there when I sing, looking at the audience.
Closed circuit television helps.
Yeah.
Closed circuit, you said?
Yes, that's one way.
And mirrors. We've all seen the, you know, smoky mirrors. Marys, you've got smoke and mirrors, I guess. But Greg, you want to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because unfortunately in Madison, people can see the organist. So I'm in the front, but our back is still always to the audience. That's just the way that the organist performed. And I played once where a violinist came up to me and said, you know, I've never seen a musician ever play with his back to the audience. And I was concerned that I would have no personal connection to the performer because you can't see their face, which is often the most expressive aspect of a person. And so I think that there are things that organists can do just in the way that they physically play, in feeling relaxed, a level of confidence that shows their complete grasp and control of the music that they're playing and the organ that they're playing. And so it gives people sort of some connection into what the organist might be thinking and might be doing, even though they can't see the face. It's such a physical instrument that's being played with your hands on multiple manuals, your feet, you're pulling out the stops manually. And I could probably set some pistons underneath my hands, but every once in a while I'll take my hand and pull something out just for show. And you never tell people that's why you're doing it. But that way people have a sense of, you know, what it is that so few people even know exactly what it is that we're doing when we're performing. So if you can give them just a glimpse of what it is that you're doing, I think that's when they're really in awe of how remarkably complex the pipe organ can be.
Well, I was going to play David next, but I think I'll go to you so that we can see you playing just for show. So let's see if I can do this because it's not the order I have things set up, but why don't you tell us, Greg, a little bit about the piece you're playing, and this is on your organ in
Madison, the Kleist. Yep. Over 4,000 pipes. It's a spectacular hall, a spectacular instrument. It's one of those instruments that when audiences hear that first chord, they're taken aback. It's such a striking sound. And this is Bollmann's Toccata. This is the last movement of his suite for organ, and a thrilling piece. It was the closing to a program, a virtual program that I played back in October in Madison.
And are great socks also a prerequisite to go with the shoes? Okay, yeah. Greg, you're muted.
Oh, I said just in case the pedal playing isn't interesting enough. You got to have just something else. So
that really is quite a gorgeous instrument.
It's spectacular, orally, visually. It's a work of art, and the people in Madison appreciate it so much, and just they flock to it. There's such love for the music played on it, and it's a very special place.
That's wonderful. Now you have some gigs coming up, and by the way, all the gigs that we're posting are obviously online gigs that anybody can attend, can watch and listen to. Lindsay from the Y is going to put those into the chat too. You've got the Jacksonville Symphony, several gigs with them coming up, and also Longwood Gardens.
Yep.
So those will be in chat for anybody who wants to attend those. An organ, we were in this area a little bit. An organ is not like a violin or a flute or even a piano. Every single one is different. So what is the first thing that you do when you sit down at a new organ? Paul?
I don't really have a set plan. I mean, I think it's just becoming familiar with the instrument. We know that Bach, quote unquote, wanted to check the organ's lungs to see if it had enough air. So he would apparently pull out all of the stops and see if the pitch would sag when he'd play a big chord. But now, of course, modern organs have a lot of wind and they can handle all of that. I like to start off soft and gradually explore the different colors. And then grow in volume and power just to see how loud it can go. I mean, you think of like if you own a snazzy car that goes real fast, you want to see how fast it goes. If you're on the speedway, well, with an organ, you want to see how loud it can go in the end. And I should just say that I think David Hurd presides over one of the greatest organs in New York City at St. Mary the Virgin. It is absolutely stunning.
So, David, when you first sat down at that organ, how did you take it out for a test drive?
Well, normally when I encounter a new instrument, I normally improvise for a while. I use improvisation as a kind of way to feel my way through the instrument. And as Paul said, which he really demonstrated the St. Mary's organ brilliantly in a recital last year. So thank you, Paul, for that. Normally I would start out with small sounds and examine the stop array and add here and add there and build up to full organ and then build down and whatever and just to get a sense of what the instrument feels like making up my own music at the time. And then of course whatever music that I'm planning to perform will direct what I'll do from there, how to make that music best express itself. But my first impression normally is gathered through improvisation.
Rachel, I see you nodding.
Yeah, it's the same experience for me as David. I begin with the improvisation, but when I have to prepare a concert, a recital on a specific organ, I must confess that my first contact with the organ is a battle. I explain myself. It's because each console is different, each sound. Of course, we have some standards and some families of stops and some common things, but each organ and each organ builder is so different. Each organ sound and acoustics are so different. My first reaction when I try an organ for a concert is, oh no, don't tell me that they didn't put this there. Sometimes you have some stops who are inaccessible, some important, the console is not always, you have some adjustable benches who are not adjustable, who are too high at the base as the basic height. You have a lot of things. So for me, it's a battle, but when the concert happens, we are the best friends of the world, the organ and I.
Greg, do you have anything to add to this?
Oh, just that I think it's important that the organist appear very comfortable when he or she perform, because I think that it affects the audience perspective of the performance that they're hearing and the music that they're listening to. And so we struggle so much in the days leading up to it, but then once we go out on stage, you've got to look as comfortable and as friendly as Rachel said with the instrument as possible. So it's one of those challenges that can be the most rewarding when it's all said and done.
And if I can just interrupt just one thing on this line, I do think it's fair to say that organists really have a more challenging experience ahead of them when they perform. Harder, I'll say it, more difficult than any other musician, given the nature of our instrument. We have to spend hours in advance of a performance getting to know an instrument. For instance, in Philadelphia, I had to spend all day, not just with the notes and the phrasing, but this instrument, trying to remember this matrix of stops and registrations and things that change from instrument to instrument. And no other musician has all of these technical and mechanical considerations that changes every time. And it takes hours and hours in advance of just the first rehearsal, frankly, with other musicians.
And I may add that it's why playing by memory at the organ is so admirable, because the ones who play, Paul and Greg, and who plays, and probably David, who plays by memory, it's not the same difficulty as playing by memory at the piano. At the piano, you have to memorize because you have distances and chords who are jumping from bass to, but at the organ, you have so many things at the console to integrate that it's more complicated to play everything by memory.
Does word go around in the organ world about what to watch out for certain instruments?
Are you saying, are there opinions amongst organists?
Well, that I would assume goes without saying, but like if you arrive at Saint-Sulpice, watch out for the flute stop or the, whatever.
Well, if I could just say very briefly, I do think, given our instrument, it's fascinating. It's a marvel of engineering. I think personally that sometimes organists and organ buffs focus too much on instruments and not enough on music. And that's also kind of a unique thing with organists. And there's a lot to be intrigued by with the organ. But some organists, that's all they're interested in is the instrument and the stops and the registration, and less so in the music.
You all mentioned improvisation, and I was going to ask, how did improvisation become part of an organist's job?
I think it's mostly as church organists that every organist has to use this skill at least once in a career. So because when you play at church, you have a lot of moments where you have to fill for the silences after the choir is done or before the mass, after. So it comes from there. So I think it probably, you can correct me guys if I'm wrong. I think it comes from church music first, and it became a specialty of the organ, and after it became a concert entertainment as well, if I can say so.
I think in addition to what Rachel has said, it should be noted that probably improvisation predated the playing of written repertoire. And
right.
Some of the first organ playing probably was improvisation, and later came written music, historically speaking.
It's just interesting that for so many other instrumentalists used to have to improvise, but aren't asked to anymore, and organists all still improvise.
Yeah, I think amongst classical musicians, organists do it the most, probably.
Well, we have one advantage. It's the quantity, the number of colors we have at the instrument. A violinist who improvises, he has just the string sound and the bow and the pizzicato. He doesn't have many choices. But an organist who improvises has an orchestra in his or her hands and feet.
Rachel, how is it? I want to get to your music now, and I want to know, why is it that you walked away from performing, from being a titular organist, and if you want to tell us what being a titular organist means, but why did you decide that you were going to make a career primarily as a composer instead?
I think I didn't decide, and I'm still playing concert and recitals.
Right.
I just left a big church job, if we could say so, because when I was at the cathedral, I had to play 75 weddings a year, 50 funerals, and I became the accompanist of the Ave Maria from Schubert and the Panis Angelicus. It was my main repertoire. So I wanted to do more than that, but I was always 50-50, if I can say, a composer and organist. Composition has always been very important in my life since I studied at the Conservatoire in Montreal. So when I began my career, it was as a performer, but composition was very important too. And the commissions came in more and more, and recently with the pandemic, it's worse, we play less, so I compose more. And it's a passion. Composition for me is a passion, so I don't complain. I always told that if I have a commission to write a piece for a gazoo, I will be very happy.
Well, instead we have you playing one of your pieces for organ, and I really love this piece. Why don't you tell us about it? This is The Flight of the Hummingbird.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to write the Flight of the Bumblebee, but someone else has taken the title. So, and I discovered that I prefer birds. I prefer to meet a hummingbird than a bumblebee. So I composed this piece as a short study. So it's a moto perpetuo, or, how you say in English, perpetual movement for the hands, but the pedal is contributing as well, and it's very soft. It's on very soft stops, and the organ was, or I play that for the video. It was in a convention of the Royal College of Organists in Canada, and it was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, at the All Saints Cathedral Church downtown Halifax, and it's a Casavant 4 manual, 75 stops. And I think I used the softer stops of the organ for this piece.
And this was recorded just not last year, but 2019.
2019, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, let's hear that now. I just love that.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's hilarious. And you don't often think of the organ as being a hilarious instrument, but it's just
Thank
wonderful.
you very much, Naomi.
And what was that organ like to play?
Oh, it was not a battle so much, this organ. It was quite easy. The console was good. And no, it was a pleasure from the beginning, I could say. And I succeeded to find some impressionistic stops, for this music. And it worked for Buxtehude, for every composer. I was quite happy with this organ.
Excellent. Hold that Buxtehude thought. We're going to get there. But first, I want to talk about, you all have commitment to new music for the instrument, because so often we think of Bach, and clearly the organ did not stop, so to speak, with Bach. But that's the composer that so many people connect with the organ. Rachel, you're composing it. Paul, you are constantly commissioning it. David, you're composing it. Greg, I assume you also are, tell me, all of you, one at a time, about new music for the organ.
Sure. Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. I was playing with a cellist, a very good friend of mine that I'm playing with at Longwood. And when we were coming up with a program, we had such difficulty finding music that was written for the organ and the cello. And of course, I, having studied with Paul and have had the opportunity to see him perform some incredible works that he has commissioned and that he's been a part of the performing of, he's always sort of preached the importance of, you've got to have music written for the instrument that we're playing today. It can't just be from the past, as people like Rachel have contributed so much to the body of literature of modern works. And so when I was talking with this friend of mine, we realized that we really had to play arrangements of music if we were to play an organ and cello concert. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was commission a work for a proper organ part and a proper cello part. And Paul Jacobs has always said, the organ can't always just be accompanying, it has to be equal. We can always play louder, but it has to be equal. And so I think these kinds of things that organists can do, they have to constantly be thinking about in order to bring not just other organists into playing, not just have. Oh, is that an echo on me?
It is, and I don't know where it's coming from. Uh-oh, it's all of a sudden on all of us.
Let's see. Oh, okay. I think it's okay. Well, I was just going to say that I think beyond just music for organists, for modern music for organists that organists can continue to perform, I think it's important to have repertoire that includes the organ with other instrumentalists, because so few instrumentalists know the organ literature and so few of them have the opportunity to play alongside it. And so then we can really branch out beyond just the organ community, but also the organ and instrumental world, and really show them, the how remarkable the organ can be. So
you're all nodding, but David started nodding first.
I'm fascinated to hear you mention that you were seeking a piece for organ and cello. One of the commissions I have now waiting my attention, Krista Rakish, one of our colleagues, organist, has commissioned me to write a piece for organ and cello, three-movement work, which I've not begun yet, but I'm really looking forward to doing that. And a few years ago, again, a saxophonist friend of mine, and an organist friend of mine, both of whom are Indiana graduates, commissioned me to write a sonata for saxophone and organ, and which was a wonderful exercise to do. And it's one of the pieces that I'm most proud of, actually. And I hope it'll be discovered one day. And it's curious that, Naomi, you said that, the organ, it's important for us to recognize it didn't stop with Bach. I realized at a later date that the organ didn't begin with Bach either, and there was this wonderful stuff preceding Bach that I hadn't known before I went to college. And so it's kind of it's fascinated me on both ends of that learning curve. And I've been very interested not only in terms of music for organ and other instruments, but also the idea that there is a dearth of American concert organ repertoire. And I felt that as an American composer, I wanted to help to fill out some of that void, at least to contribute to an ongoing tradition in the United States.
And Paul, I'm sorry, did I jump in on you?
No, I just in North America. I really want to include Rachel in this as well as a composer in North America.
Yes, the Americas. Paul, your commitment is more as a commissioner or pushing the repertoire forward rather than as a composer. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. And Greg alluded to this earlier. I encourage my students at Juilliard to seek out young budding composers to consider the instrument. And the organ can be a daunting instrument if you don't play it. If you don't know the grammar, the vocabulary, it can be intimidating and you just avoid it. But I can think of few instruments that can excite the human imagination so much and with such passion and excitement than the organ. I mean, just given the scope of its dynamic range and color and everything else, and its virtuosity. And I think it's very important to show that an art form continues to live. I mean, the organ, as David said, it goes back really to the Roberts Bridge Codex in the 14th century, and there's this unbroken line to this very day. I mean, no other instrument has that. It's spectacular. And to see the instrument, of course, existing in concert halls around the world and working with these composers, I tell composers, just get the notes. Let's pair yourself up with an organist. Don't be worried about some of the details, and that organist will help you out with registration. And just get the notes and get some advice, and then just start there. And be open to suggestions from the organist. And, sure enough, you'll produce something that's wonderful.
Now, within the world of pipe organs, there are different kinds good for different kinds of music. What makes an organ better for, say, Baroque over Romantic or Romantic over Baroque music? Rachel?
Well, it's a question I didn't want to answer.
Okay, then somebody else. David, Paul, Greg,
yeah,
whoever wants it.
But I think, Naomi, that I would say that in my ideal vision of the organ, every organ is supposed to be ideal to play every music. So this is my dream of an organ. I love to play an eclectic instrument. And when I played for 15 years, I was associate at St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal. It's a Beckerat, a German organ. It was built in the 1960s. And this organ builder was supposed to build Baroque instrument. And it's a 5-manual organ, 5,800 pipes. And it's a wonderful instrument, but so eclectic. You can play César Franck repertoire on that. You can play Bach, Buxtehude, and even Renaissance music. You can play French Baroque. You can play Louis Viern's music, and it sounds wonderful. So for me, the ideal organ is this kind of instrument where everything sounds wonderful. And it's the role of the organist also to have the instrument and the repertoire sound well on the instrument. It's a part of our job.
Yeah, Rachel, you're a woman after my own heart.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would just clarify by saying that it is true that some instruments do play, given how vast the organ repertoire is, some instruments do specialize. Organists specialize, instruments specialize, and they do certain things beautifully. But again, I appreciate just the all-encompassing nature of the instrument, emphasizing the artist and the music most of all. That's what matters, that it communicates something.
Well, I think it's time to hear from David. And so I told everybody to hold that books to who'd have thought. And
Yes.
once again, I have to apologize for starting towards the end of the piece. We're only going to get to hear the chaconne from the Buxtehude Prelude in G minor. You want to tell us about?
Yes, well, Buxtehude wrote 4 organ preludia on in G minor, and this particular one, the final section of it, is a ground bass where every 4 measures sort of repeats a harmonic pattern with variations on the manual played over it, and it's a fascinating piece. Very often, the final sections of Buxtehude pieces are fugues, but this one is a chaconne, as you said, and the organ is a lively Fulcher organ, a 3-manual instrument of quite heroic sound, this is organ at Christ Church Cathedral in Nashville. And it's from a recital I played 10 years ago or so. And what we'll hear begins, the theme is announced in a rather obvious trumpet stop.
Okay, let's hear the trumpet stop. I love that shot within the shot so that we get to see the feet and the hands all working. That's fantastic.
Again, it was a situation where obviously the organist would not have been visible to the audience without the help of closed circuit.
That was really terrific. So I want to get to some of the questions. I have more questions, but we have people who've been waiting patiently to get to their questions. Somebody wants to know, can you delineate in terms of learning organ works when an organist changes from being an amateur organist to an accomplished organist? One of you who's a teacher want to take this?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, it's like anything. You certainly reach a certain point when you can play a certain level of repertoire, and presumably you play that with ease. I mean, any activity that you engage in life. I mean, if you're a virtuoso, let's say you're a figure skater, you make it look natural, you make it look simple, you make it look easy, even though it takes countless hours of preparation and a labor of love, truly. So I would say once you don't appear to be belabored in an activity, then you've gone from amateur to professional. Let's put it that way. Once it just seems like it's natural to you, then you're a professional.
Great.
I would add to that I think that's very fine perception. And in addition to that, I think that to some degree, when you come to that point of being professional, it's because others recognize you as such. As much as how your self-perception, it's when others recognize you as professional. I mean, I know that certainly was true of my recognizing myself as a composer, because I thought of myself as an organist who wrote music. And then people began to treat me like I was a composer. And then I was able to own that.
Great.
Good point.
And I also think that something that Paul spoke about a lot when I was a student was the ability to listen to oneself as they play. And I think on the organ, this is one of the most challenging things because we have so much going on all the time that sometimes, I think young organists forget the most basic musical thing, which is to listen, just to listen to the beauty of the line, to listen to what it is that you're producing. And so I think once you can get to a point where you can comfortably play a piece of music and listen to yourself critically, that's when you can really start to, to understand the music as it should be understood.
Great. So we have a bunch of questions. I want to try and get through them. Emily Blair Stribling knows two of you and says that she has loved the organ forever. As a priest in the Episcopal Church, what do these wonderfully gifted organists think about how the organ can lead the church into the future? David, you taught for so long at General Theological Seminary. Do you have an answer for that?
That's a tough question as well. I think that in many ways, the organ has been associated with religious practice to a great extent, and certainly played a major role, only slightly second to the human voice as the principal sound instrument of music in worship settings. I think in the past century or so, the organ maybe has been joined by lots of other styles and instrumentalities in church music. And although I still think it has a strong and powerful future because of the many aspects of its nature, the fact that it can be played by one person, it can have vast orchestral capabilities. It can support large numbers of people singing. It can accompany choral music and accompany other instruments. It has a practical effectiveness that makes it quite uniquely ideal for a lot of religious practice. And so I really do think that the organ has a future in being a primary instrument for religious worship.
Rachel, somebody wants to know who's the publisher of your Hummingbird piece.
It's Wayne Leopold Editions in North Carolina. I'm a house composer at Wayne Leopold Editions since 2006. So all my organ music is or will be published there. So it's in the 12 short pieces, volume 4, I think.
Can you maybe type that into the chat so that this person can find your music?
Okay, I will.
You do that while Paul answers this question for him. In what ways can an organ transcription discover aspects of timbre, harmony, and rhythm that may be hidden but are not necessarily heard in the original?
Oh, yes. Well, again, the music can take on a different life, taking it to a different instrument. And an organist has the opportunity to bring out certain lines. I mean, you are the conductor of an orchestra. I mean, an organist said years ago that it's almost incorrect to say an organ recital when you have thousands of pipes coming together in concert. It's very much an organ concert. And if you're taking transcriptions and these large pieces to an organ, you can bring out anything you want. I think that it's worth trying to find those things that maybe you wouldn't ordinarily hear. Don't try to make it exactly as the original, because you're never going to get there. You have to make some new discoveries along the way and bring them out.
Greg, you want to take this one? Do most organists memorize the music and play without sheet music?
I think it's dependent on the organists. I do in large part because of my study with Paul Jacobs, and it's certainly always freed me when I perform. I think the people that hear me in Madison have come to expect it, so now I'm kind of stuck in having to do it. But certainly I couldn't imagine now, having played from memory regularly, not performing from memory, because it really does free me to perform just as I'd like to, and gives me the opportunity to really focus my attention on the things that I'd like to focus my attention on during a performance. But every performer has their own, approach to what they feel comfortable doing. And I think that that's the most important thing, is what can you do that makes you feel as comfortable as a performer, so that the audience can just sit back and love the music you're playing.
So here's a really specific question. Katie Hughes wants to know your opinions on pedaling using only toes in Bach. Yay or nay, and to what other composers would you apply this approach?
Well, can I answer first? It's definitely no. I think that you may have the choice to play with 1, 2, and with the whole foot, or with the heel if you want, with the knees if you prefer. What is important is the music. Some people do that just to be faithful to some tradition, and even at that, we're not sure. Do we know exactly what organ shoes Bach was wearing when he played? So, no, I think we can do legato nowadays at the pedal. We can do a lot of things. And the organist, the performer, must choose whatever he or she wants, how he or she wants to play the pedal.
Yeah, I mean, one can still play in a stylish way, observing the historical period, but you don't have to use all toes. And Bach had heels, just like we do, and likely he used them on occasion. And we have no idea what he did and didn't do exactly. So I would say be practical. Bach was a practical man. We know that. And I think it's sometimes organists can be a little rigid. It was once said that organists have a lot of this and not enough of this, some. And it's important, because the instrument is so intellectually stimulating, that we sometimes as organists forget that it is the emotion that connects with other human hearts.
A slight historical note on this, and I agree entirely with the thrust of what Rachel and Paul have said. Some of the old organs were, the key desk was proportioned in such a way, because of the way the action worked, that the pedals were further back, and so that the use of the heel on the natural keys was far less comfortable to do. And as such, and there are such instruments still in existence. And when one plays such an instrument, one finds oneself naturally probably not using the heel very much. And so there are practical issues here. And the style of playing with the toes only may indicate a certain kind of approach to articulation, and whatever, which may be appropriate to certain music and not appropriate to other music. So again, it's not an always situation. It's fundamentally practical and about the music.
And David, I may add that I admired your heel in the Buxtehude at the end. You were playing the last note just with the heel, and I thought, great, wonderful. You felt comfortable doing that, and that's perfect.
Well, I've been outed now.
Here we go.
I always tell the students when they do that to call the police and arrest them. Right. Use the heel.
So this is real organist nitty gritty we're getting into here. Toes and heels. This sounds like an easy one. How many staves is organ music notated on?
Well, usually three, but it can be four. We have some quartet, 4 parts in French Baroque, for example, music. You can read on 4 staves in order to play in a quartet. So you have 3 parts in the hands and 1 at the pedal. It doesn't happen often, but personally, as a composer, I write on 3 staves.
There's some pieces by Maurice Durflay, for example, where because of the sounds that he wants used and how it's more clear to write them, he uses more than 3 staves just to make clear what manual and what sonority is sounding at given times.
In tournamere music as well,
yes,
and often in tournamere. It's quite difficult to read for an average organist, so you have to practice. It's a good exercise.
Yeah.
So back to Bach. This is for Paul Jacobs. You did a Bach marathon early on in your career. What was your timeline for learning the works of Bach when you were a student, and how did you maintain what you had already learned?
Oh my, maintaining is impossible over a long period of time. There's just so much music that you can't keep it all up humanly. But a lot of practice. I mean, an obsessive level of practice, cutting off everything else and being driven by a passion for the music. And I love the music so much then. I still do. It gives me more than anything else, any other force in life. And I just want to share that brilliance and the genius of Bach with other people. How did I do it? I don't know. I just practiced and practiced and practiced, and not everybody should do it. And I'm not sure I would do a marathon again.
And Paul, you had to decide between the Grammy or being drafted in the first round by the Steelers, right? So that was kind of, those were your two. You thought, which do I decide? So clearly you made the right decision, but.
That's right. That's right.
Speaking of practicing, somebody wants to know, considering you're busy performing and teaching and liturgical schedules, how often do you find time to just sit down and practice? This is for all of you.
Can I answer first? As a composer, of course, sometimes I have deadline for commissions, so I can be 1 week without going to the organ, but I have my organ at home. When I have recitals to prepare, then you don't have to find time, you take the time to. So you just have to organize your schedule and have in your mind how many hours you need to prepare these recitals. I think everyone is different. I know some organists who practice 8-9 hours a day, and I'm not able to do more than 5 hours a day, guys.
Well, I will interject and just say you're very kind, Rachel, but my students know that they need to make the time to practice every day. And it's very important. Maybe 1 day off a week, but that's it.
So we also got a question about the pipe organ versus the digital organ, which is a question that I had too. Can you explain the difference between a pipe organ and a digital organ? Greg, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think with the pipe organ, there are so many other elements beyond just the sounds of the organ. There's the architectural beauty that comes with a pipe organ. There's a uniqueness to the sounds of each of the stops and the instrument itself. This is not to say that I am opposed to playing digital organs. In fact, in my home, I have a pipe organ there, and then I have a digital organ right there. So certainly, I think there are times and places, especially certain venues that can't, for whatever reason, have a pipe organ, have a digital organ, and it gives people still the opportunity to listen to organ music, which I think should always be the priority, the music over the instrument. But I think that there's a craftsmanship and a beauty to the pipe organ that is unparalleled. And I imagine, the other panelists think similarly when it comes to that, because when you've heard a beautiful pipe organ, it's thrilling beyond words.
And Paul, I know you have some very strong feelings about this when it comes to Philharmonic / Avery Fisher / David Geffen Hall in New York.
Yes, I do. And I think I shared with you, Naomi, I've written a couple of articles for the Wall Street Journal about why Geffen should reacquire one. I don't know if it will happen. Likely not, is my thinking at this point. There used to be one until the 70s. Carnegie Hall used to have one, and they were removed. And then you see what's going on around the country with pipe organs being placed in concert halls, like in Madison. You see what Greg's doing, Philadelphia, and many other cities. And around the world. I mean, in China, all of these concert halls now have spectacular pipe organs, Asia, etc. And so I think it's very short-sighted of what's going on in New York City, the concert halls right now.
I think it's fair to say that the pipe organ is the historic instrument, and the digital instrument is a simulation of a pipe organ. By sampling and by digital means. So one is the original thing, and the second is a simulation of it. Sometimes a very impressive simulation of it, but a simulation.
Listening to an organ is so intertwined with the space the instrument is in. How have all of you dealt with online performance, which is not space friendly, as evidenced by this?
I would just say the organ is a very difficult instrument to record. I mean, even under the best of circumstances. And you really have to, I think, experience it live for the full effect. It's part of the architecture. The acoustical properties of the instrument are something that have to be experienced in person. Though, I mean, there are some very good recordings out there. I personally have found it difficult, but it's better than nothing.
And from a visual perspective, the one sort of nice thing about performing virtually is that I think a lot of people have seen all of the intricacies of what it takes to play the organ that when your back is to the audience, they don't quite experience. And so while the sound and that exposure, and certainly it is much, much better to hear a pipe organ heard live, people have gotten the opportunity during this pandemic to see what it is that we do and all that we do visually. So there have been some good things that have come from these virtual performances, I think.
And I will add that I had some premieres, some pieces who were premiered last summer, for example, by Alan Morrison during the AGO convention online, because it was impossible in person. And it's a good visibility. It's most visibility because of that. But the other thing I would say, I think it's difficult for the audience to follow organ music just on computer. So I advise people who want to get acquainted with new pieces or concerts online to have their headphones and to listen really with a good sound system to understand the depth, to have the depth of and the perspective of the whole sound.
And David, you've been dealing with church services during this time.
True. I have the utmost admiration for my colleagues who have performed recitals virtually during this time. I myself have not done a virtual recital. I almost have a couple times, but I've declined to do so for my own reasons that I find playing for a camera far more frightening than playing for people, and far less rewarding. And knowing that they're actually, I might be reaching more people than I ever could reach in person. Somehow, my own psychological enjoyment is not as great. So I've resisted doing these performances, but I'm so grateful for my colleagues who have.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to leave this, because we are so grateful to you. Since this wasn't a recital, we could get all your lovely faces here to tell us all about this. I want to say thank you so much, especially thanks to Paul for helping me to find all of you other wonderful people. Paul Jacobs, David Hurd, Rachel Laurin, or Rachel Laurin, if we're being French,
Wonderful, bravo.
and Greg Zelek. We look forward to hearing you soon in person on great organs in great spaces. And we look forward to your online performances. And as I say, there are links to them in chat, and there will be links to them on the website, the 92nd Street Y website for this session. I have another really exciting conversation coming up for 92Y School of Music on January 23rd. Two of today's great countertenors, Arya Nussbaum-Cohen and John Holliday, whom you may have seen last month as a finalist on NBC's The Voice, plus male soprano Samuel Marino. They will be joining me from literally all over the globe, Australia to Berlin, on January 23rd, Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for that on the 92nd Street Y website, where you can also make a donation to support 92Y. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, thanks to the panelists, and good night.
Thank you, Naomi. Good night.
Thank you very much.